Okay, so we looked at the for loop. Now let's look at the while loop. This is another C++ style loop that we can use. And again, this is counter-controlled repetition, so I kept the essentials up here, which will also come into play with the while loop. So let's use the same example. In the last video, we used the for loop to fill the screen with diamonds, 5,000 diamonds. Now let's use a while loop to do that. Again, we have to get back to those essentials. And the thing with the while loop is, unlike the for loop, you really have to be careful to make sure all of the essentials are there, because it's not part of the basic syntax. I mentioned that's why I like the for loop so much. It's really hard to mess up. The while loop is easier to mess up, as will the do loop, which is what we'll talk about next. But all right, so I'm looking at my essentials here. I need a counter variable, so I have to create a counter variable. Again, this will be an integer variable, and we have to give it some kind of starting value. So why don't I call it counter? Again, you'll see, little throwaway variable names for loop counters like X or Z or I or something like that. But I'll use counter just to make it easier to follow here. And let's give it a starting value. We talked about starting at 0, starting at 1. You can really start counting anywhere, but typically you'll start counting at 0 or 1. So we'll start counting at 0. Okay, so that's just a simple variable declaration. I have the variable in place, and I have its starting value, which is 0. So now let's dive into the while loop. And now we're getting into our, you don't need a space there. It wouldn't be a big deal if you left it there, though. But let's get into our second essential, which is the condition, or the relational expression. And it'll be the same as it was in the last video. We're going to go while counter is less than 5,000. Okay? And then, of course, let's throw down some curly braces. While counter is less than 5,000, we're going to do this. Make a diamond on the screen. Okay, so we have essentials 1 and 2 covered. Now, very importantly, we need essential number 3, which is the increment. Okay, let me show you what happens, and this is why it's so easy to mess up the while loop, because if you forget that increment, this is what happens. Okay, do you see this? I'm getting my diamonds, and look at this flashing. It just keeps running and running. I'm way more than 5,000 diamonds now. What I've done is I've created an infinite loop. And what I did there, to pause it, you can basically press the pause button on your keyboard, or Control C will send you into break mode, so you can break, click OK, and just stop your program. So pause or Control C, just get to a point where you can stop your program. What you've done is you've put yourself into an infinite loop. We're saying counter is equal to 0, and we want to keep drawing diamonds on the screen while counter is less than 5,000. If I don't give counter the opportunity to change, and that's really what your increment does, it increments counter, it changes it by 1 every time. If you forget that increment, counter is never going to change. Counter remains at 0. 0 is less than 5,000, so this is always going to evaluate to true. When this evaluates to true, the body of the loop runs, and so it keeps running, because 0 is less than 5,000. It always has been, it always will be until the end of time, and that's it. The loop never ends. So you need to be careful about that increment. So we need to increment counter, and now we'll run. And there we go, 5,000 diamonds. Okay, so be careful. Another thing, you need to be careful of those curly braces. We talked about this in the last video, the fact that if you don't put curly braces, then the compiler assumes a one-statement loop body. So you can probably guess what's going to happen here. Back to the never-ending loop, which is, here's why. here's the problem. This is the loop, so look who gets left out in the cold, our increment. So it's like it's not even there. So, you need to be careful. In fact, with your while loop, you're probably always going to want to use the curly braces. I told you to just use them regardless. Just get in the habit. It's a good habit to get into, and then you'll never have that problem. So there's your while loop.